This week on Perspective,
we're back.
Assessing the promise, the priorities, and the reality. With less than a year before the next federal election, we begin this new season of Perspective with a look at the foreign policy promises and priorities of the Trudeau government. The phrase "Canada's back" has since become a cliche, frayed by the realities of governing and the politics of ever-changing, even unpredictable international relations. The very foundation of generations of Canada's foreign policy, the values of liberal democracy, a global order based on rules, and the institutions that uphold them, multilateralism, all are now being challenged. The Foreign Affairs Minister, in a key speech last spring, acknowledged those challenges, but vowed to take them on.
That is what Canadians do. We step up.
Canada has taken the lead promoting gender equality and a feminist foreign aid policy. It has stepped up its defense commitment to NATO and UN peacekeeping. Canada took a lead role in the secret, dangerous, and ultimately successful plot to rescue the White Helmets in Syria. But then there was the much ridiculed spectacle of the Prime Minister's visit to India. Foreign Minister Freeland's tweet diplomacy, which enraged the Saudi government and effectively led to the severing of official relations. And then, of course, there's the recent tense, drawn-out trade negotiations with the U.S., which for a time became a foreign policy preoccupation. Those are just a few examples. On the program today, we're going to take a step back to try to put Canada's foreign policy and its role in the current global context. We'll speak to some critics about some of the specifics, and we'll hear from students of international affairs about what they think. We begin with Jennifer Welsh. She's a professor and chair in international relations at the European University Institute. She is also the incoming Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University. That's where we met. When Trudeau came to power, there was this real fascination with this young, fresh Canadian face and what it might mean more broadly for what we've called Western liberal democratic values. Where do you think that stands now for Canada?
I think that image is still important, although I think the Prime Minister shares that stage now with a couple of other leaders, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the new leader in Spain, who's a young social democrat. But I do think that his persona, his youthfulness, the values that he speaks for are being seen positively. But I think unlike 2 or 3 years ago, people in other countries are paying a lot more attention to the substance behind it as well. So it's not just about the image, it's now about what are you actually putting in place and what are you doing? Tell me a bit about the substance. What do you see and what don't you see? Well, I think we're in a moment where to act on the global stage as a Canadian Prime Minister is something that isn't necessarily going to be electorally successful, if you really look hard at the numbers, right? And so while it's important to say the right things and do a modest amount, you could make as a political strategist a hard-headed calculation that we actually don't need to deliver much to keep the Canadian public happy. And I'm being very cynical when I say this. Yeah. But I think to a certain extent there is an expectation both here and abroad that the idea that Canada is back has to have really tangible things behind it. And I think it's a mixed bag at the moment. I think on the one hand, the feminist international policy has been something really striking. And it's had some elements that are quite significant. The ELSI initiative on peacekeeping, that is trying to work with the United Nations and other countries to enhance the participation of women in peacekeeping operations, which is a huge task, but really matters. Now, if you look at the fine print, is it a huge amount of resources? No, but as an initiative, I think it's interesting and consistent. The decision to appoint a female ambassador for women, peace and security, another important initiative. And so I think that is something with substance, although we could do more. I think on some of the more traditional issues and buckets of activity, I think others would criticize us for being pretty underwhelming. And
For
so
example?
well, if we think about contributions to peacekeeping, the top 25 countries who contribute are still largely not Western countries, and Canada is not in that list. Now, it's 9th out of 10th in terms of financial contributions, and it's made a strategic decision to try to put its money to reform peacekeeping operations. But when you look at the tough zones in which peacekeepers are operating around the world, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, most countries are saying, who is really putting skin in the game? And I think the other area would be development assistance. We have a very energetic ambassador in New York who believes, I think rightly, that in the future, financing for development cannot come only from governments. And so he's leading a very interesting and innovative movement to try to expand the pot with more private money. But still, when you consider what Canada's doing on ODA, it lags significantly behind not just our peers who are mid-sized economies, but previous governments. The Mulroney government, the Harper government. Our percentage is 0.26% of GNI, gross national income. It's the lowest it's been in several decades. And if you compare the increase that was promised, which is $2 billion over 5 years, barely exceeds the rate of inflation and is nowhere near the increase for military spending. And I think these things matter because with billions more, which it would require, you can actually make a difference. You can target money. We have to think about ODA differently than we did in the past, but you could do some very significant things with a big increase in that kind of money. You could focus it on educating young girls in the developing world. You could focus it on education in refugee camps. You could say, we're going to add $2 billion to the pot or more and actually do something significant. That's what I don't see.
And you think that's political expediency?
No, I don't think it's entirely political expediency. I think there's a rightfully, there are questions about what does ODA do? How do we measure its effectiveness? How do we make what we do accountable to Canadians, which is really important. It's also in a mixed budget where you've got to give more to different things. You know, it's all about trade-offs. And so there was a strong push to add more to the military. So I think it's a combination of things. I actually think, personally, there probably hasn't been enough thought yet about what could creatively be done in terms of rethinking our development assistance in the 21st century.
You have often suggested that we need to sort of change our thinking about many things, overseas development assistance being one, about immigration, that we need to be more innovative in the way we look at that, even just the way we look at relations with Russia. We need to change the way we think. What's the change in thinking required that would, if the idea is to have a country like Canada punch above its weight, which was the sort of phrase that was used, what does Canada have to do? What does this government have to do to be able to do that?
You know, the phrase is a great one, you know, punch above your weight. And in a way, I think the first step is to stop being self-conscious in that way, that what we're seeking to do is punch above our weight. It's more to say we are one of the largest medium-sized economies in the world. We have an incredibly skilled and diverse population. What can we do that will make a significant impact with what we can bring? And I think the moment is interesting because we are, according to many analysts, returning to an era of strategic rivalry among big powers. And I think there would be a temptation to say, let's dust off the playbook from the Cold War and think about being a middle power and trying to find a way to navigate in between. And I think that would be misplaced. I think trying to rediscover a middle power identity in this world is not going to be that productive. I think it's about concrete initiatives based on research that we think can improve the lives of others around the world, can enhance security, can enhance prosperity. And a lot of it has to be below, as I've learned in the last 3 or 4 years, when people ask me where I find optimism, it is hard to find optimism at a great power level. At even a diplomatic level, look at our UN Security Council. It's paralyzed. And so yes, Canada should go for a seat. Let's hope they're successful. But we have to be very honest about the limitations of what the Security Council will do. And what needs to happen in our era is that we need to empower people at local levels to make a difference in their countries. That takes money, that takes innovation, and it also involves a certain amount of modern diplomacy. But I think, first of all, we have to let go of that self-conscious idea that we have to punch above our weight. We just have to be Canada. We have to be a successful liberal democracy in a world where there is backsliding from liberal democracy. And maybe what I've just said is part of the answer. Maybe we want to invest a lot of our attention over the next 10 years in bolstering liberal democracy around the world.
I was going to say, because that outward view comes at a time when the political attention seems to be much more inward. Certainly in the United States, what we hear from the Trump administration is focused on what happens to a large degree internally. And they're not alone. That's happening in many countries. So how do you balance that, I guess, between that notion that somehow, if you think liberal democratic values should continue, then how do you make that happen in a different kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that's occupying me the most right now in thinking about, because I think what you see in the United States is a confusion of what is in the national interest with complete, undiluted national sovereignty. And I don't think the two are the same. Thinking about what is in your national interest as a country, particularly when you're as globally connected as Canada is, it is to have the courage, the trust to cooperate with others on solutions, to not retreat behind. And we simply can't, because we're too vulnerable. But I think also in the era that we're living in, there needs to be a lot more humility about sharing liberal democracy. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone else in being caught up in the 1990s with the idea that this could be exported. You know, that we could provide a checklist to other countries of the institutions they needed to build and come with our briefcases and our expertise, and now let us help you do it. I think we have a lot more humility, many of us, rightfully, that this has to be about mutual learning. It has to be about national ownership, that countries are going to do this differently, and finding a way to hold to standards that are the basic minimum that must be upheld, but recognizing that, you know, maybe you won't have an election in quite this way, and maybe your commission for national minorities will look differently than ours looks. But we have to provide solidarity from the outside, and we have to encourage civil society, which is the key to a thriving liberal democracy. Look at the US. What's going to save that democracy over the next 4 years? Maybe it's checks and balances, but it's going to be US civil society.
One of the interesting surveys a while ago that came out, and it was a survey of particularly younger voters in the United States, and they've also done work, I think, in Europe as well, where they've asked younger people about the importance of democracy and whether or not they would be prepared to accept an authoritarian government. And those numbers among young people particularly, who are willing to accept the notion of authoritarianism, are significantly higher than they used to be, that the whole idea of democracy isn't as important to other people. So how does that jive with what you're telling me now?
It's really chilling. I've seen those statistics as well. And I think it reminds us that liberal democracy for many periods in history was not the dominant form of government, and that this is it's a very fragile thing. What's interesting about those numbers is that they're less pronounced in Europe. And what you see when you dig is that it is not so much that young people are embracing authoritarian values is they're not happy with the democracy that they're getting. I agree that it looks worse in the United States, but to me this speaks a lot to a need to rethink education, civic values, to really understand our history and what it takes to support formal institutions. Because I think a lot of the focus of many over the last 30 years has been on formal institutions. As long as we have courts and as long as we have parliaments and we have elections, then everything is fine. But it meant that a lot of people became very complacent about the longevity of their system. And it's more than that. And so when I looked at those statistics, and I have a colleague at the European University Institute in Florence who I was discussing this with, he says, fascinating that in Europe it's not as bad. Why is that? When you dig in, I think probably the nature of their historical experience,
right.
Occupied, relatively recent democracies, but I think we have a lot to learn from them about what they're doing in terms of education as well.
You mentioned complacency. Do you think Canada is perhaps more complacent than many other countries about the shape of our democracy?
Absolutely. I think specifically when we think about the US, we have very different national cultures, national identities, but there are trends in the United States that are also nascent in Canada. And I think in many respects, we have not been tested in ways because of our space, because of our capacity to absorb immigrants, because of the way in which we've managed our budgets. We haven't been really pushed. And I think we are to a certain extent complacent. But I would say there is a slight difference in what we aren't complacent about, but which I think is really in our DNA, especially in the city that we're sitting in today, is diversity. You know, that many of us are minorities, that we simply experience that as a day-to-day reality. And I do think that makes us aware in a way that is not the case in other countries of the dangers of winner-takes-all politics, that there has to be a way of accommodating difference through the political system. So I'm really interested to see in the papers right now people discussing proportional representation.
Right.
How do we give even greater expression to that? I need to weigh the pros and cons in my own mind. I'm not ready to say where I come down on that. But I do think that is an incredibly strong feature. But we're being tested. You know, the city that I grew up in Western Canada has much larger immigrant populations than it ever had when I was a young child. It's difficult. It's really confronting. They're doing amazing things at a municipal level, but we can't deny the fact that this creates a huge set of challenges for people who are in the quote, host community, right?
If one of the key components of a successful foreign policy and sort of global citizenship is basically taking care of democracy at home, how would you assess the leadership of this government?
I think it's very strong on two counts. One is it's very strong on the language that it's trying to use and encourage. I think what we've seen in the US, and it's been documented but elsewhere, is actually a decline in civility of language. And we can say this doesn't matter, but I think in democratic debate it matters enormously, the degree to which we speak to each other in civil terms, we show mutual respect, we avoid extremes. I think the second strength is on gender equality, because I think that is not the last bastion, but one of the last bastions of democratic reform. And I think the fact that this country has a cabinet with as many female ministers as it has, the commitment to gender equality, it's really significant when you are traveling outside of Canada. So I think Those are two really positive dimensions. I think we need to do more to renew our institutions, to think about our party systems, to think about our electoral systems, to think about the financing of elections, to think about our judicial institutions as well, and those mechanisms that respect rights. Those we need to be very vigilant about. And I think there's been less attention to that in the very recent past, but I think it's important.
Thank you very much. It's good to talk to you.
And you, thank you.